Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Death of the West by Pat Buchanan. As I've mentioned previously, after Buchanan's 1996 run for president, he was encouraged to write his ideas down, write a few books describing his platform in more detail. And he did exactly that. He wrote 3 books. He was initially going to write 1 book, but he found he had so much to say that he really needed 3. And each book addressed one particular aspect of his campaign, one particular aspect of his policy platform. And there were really 3 parts to it. And I think those 3 components define, to me anyway, the core of paleoconservatism. Pat Buchanan, I think, was the major figure of paleoconservatism. He wasn't the only one, but he was one of the major ones, and he was certainly the one that was most, I think, in the public eye. And so he wrote these 3 books detailing the 3 core components of paleoconservatism. All 3 of them were essentially conservative, but had a nationalist aspect to them. And that's really what made them paleoconservative. The neocons don't have a nationalist side to them. Neoconservatism is sort of conservatism without the nationalism. Sort of a globalist conservatism of sorts. Debatable how conservative it is, but we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But at the very least, it is not nationalist, whereas paleoconservatism is nationalist. And Pat Buchanan is a nationalist, and these 3 books detail 3 components of nationalism. The first book was The Great Betrayal, and I reviewed that some episodes back. I don't recall exactly which episode it was. You'll have to look it up. But I looked at that one, and then a little bit, that one was about protectionism, economic nationalism, sometimes called, and our international trade policies, and not allowing ourselves to be taken advantage of in these free trade arrangements, particularly when other nations are imposing tariffs on us, but we don't impose any sort of tariffs on them because we're so almost religiously beholden to the theory of free trade, despite the fact that we've gone from the world's economic powerhouse to a nation so saddled with debt that it has become an existential crisis. Something has gone wrong with our economy, certainly, and Buchanan makes a strong case, and I agree, that our international trade deficit has been a critical component of our economic downfall. The second book was Republic, Not an Empire, and that one dealt with our international relations in more of a in regard to like military activities and participation in international organizations like NATO and others, and really just about the more isolationist aspect of American policy. And he spends a lot of time harking back to earlier republicanism. Both of The Great Betrayal and A Republic, Not an Empire are in part history books. The Great Betrayal tells the history of our trade relations, and A Republic, Not an Empire tells the history of our foreign relations. And they both make the point that our policy in the early 20th century, really around the beginning of the 20th century or the late 19th century, was pretty good. And he makes the case that we've deviated. That deviation, in both cases, I think, our trade and our international relations, starts largely with Wilson. But it has been an ongoing thing. It can't all be blamed on Wilson because no one has bothered to turn the ship around. Generation after generation of Americans have continued the policies that have led us into greater and greater quagmires and difficult situations and losing prestige and just haven't really benefited us all that much. And then the third book is this one that I'm reviewing today. And this is the third aspect of Buchanan's nationalism, and it is the nativism, and it has to do with immigration. This book is a little different than the other two. This book is not really a history book like the other ones are. Not to say that they're exclusively history books, but they deal a lot with history. If you go back and listen to the Republic Not an Empire episode, I talked in that one about Wilson, and that's kind of the nature of it. He walks through historically the various points at which we've gone from having a good policy to having the present bad policy, the various points at which our policy deviated from its original form. This book doesn't walk through history in that way. It's much more of an expansive examination, in part philosophical, in part political. It's an examination of the present state of things and social issues that have led to it. It's called The Death of the West, and it is very much an examination of the entire Western world, not just America, but the entire Western world and what we're doing wrong to bring about the circumstance of our own destruction. And immigration is a major part of that. This book came out in 2002. I reviewed a book called Immigration and the American Identity that came out in 1995, so that was 7 years before this one. It's obvious, looking at some of these books, that immigration is not a new problem. It's just that we are finally opening our groggy, sleepy eyes and looking around us and realizing what we have allowed our leaders to do. But it's not a new problem. It's just a problem that has become progressively worse to eventually reach the present point where it has become unbearably bad, and we have no choice but to address it. If we had listened to figures like Buchanan 20 years ago, frankly, 30 years ago, if we had listened to figures like Thomas Fleming and Chronicles magazine and the authors who wrote in that book, Immigration and the American Identity, which was taken from Chronicles magazine, if we had listened to these paleo-conservatives from 85, when they first started talking about this in that magazine, now 40 years ago, if we had listened to them then, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in now. But better late than never. The time has come to address the problem. So the contents of this book are not exactly up to date. It's 23 years old now, quarter of a century nearly, after this book was written. But as was the case with the other book on immigration, the situation has not gotten any better. Everything in this book remains true, only more so. All of the bad things described continue to be bad and just are more intense and more destructive today than ever before. So let's take a walk down memory lane and look at The Death of the West from 2002 and have a look at the situation. And so another thing that I'll mention now is that this book is not really just, as I said, all about immigration. It talks about other stuff. And because I had talked about immigration a bit in that other book, and, well, I also talked about some other stuff, but one can only harp on for so long about immigration before it becomes obvious that we need to examine why we have done this to ourselves. What are the underlying causes for this horrific situation? And as I've said, population, our low birth rates, exploding birth rates in the third world, collapsing birth rates in the first world, that's a core problem. That is kind of the core problem that we face. And it's one of the core problems that we face. I should be more specific. Obviously, there are other problems like just the sentiment among people that it's acceptable to bring in such massive numbers of people, and the delusion that they can simply become American at the drop of a hat by showing up on our shores or showing up on the shores of any other Western nation, that they can therefore become French, that they can become English, that they can become Italian simply because they arrived. It's a delusional belief, totally delusional. But there's more to it than just that, and that's what some of this book goes into, and that's some of what I want to talk about today. And so I'm going to actually start at the end of the book, not the total end, but near the end. He provides a bit of synopsis, and that synopsis is going to help us gain a bird's eye view of the situation at hand. Like all my episodes, I'll read a couple sections, starting with this one, provide a little bit of commentary, so that you can get it straight from Pat Buchanan via my show. So here Buchanan says, quote, "America and the West face 4 clear and present dangers. The first is a dying population. Second is the mass immigration of peoples of different colors, creeds, and cultures, changing the character of the West forever. The third is the rise to dominance of an anti-Western culture in the West, deeply hostile to its religions, traditions, and morality, which has already sundered the West. The fourth is the breakup of nations and the defecting of ruling elites to a world government whose rise entails the end of nations. The West does not lack the capacity or power to repel these dangers, but it seems to lack the desire or will to maintain itself as a vital, separate, unique civilization. As the ex-Trotskyite and geostrategist James Burnham wrote over a third of a century ago, I do not know what the cause is of the West's extraordinarily rapid decline, which is most profoundly shown by the deepening loss, among the leaders of the West, of confidence in themselves and in the unique quality of their own civilization, and by a correlated weakness of the Western will to survive. The cause or causes have something to do, I think, with the decay of religion, and with an excess of material luxury, and I suppose with getting tired, worn out, as all things temporal do. This struggle to preserve the old creeds, cultures, and countries of the West is the new divide between left and right. This struggle will define what it means to be a conservative. This is the cause of the 21st century and the agenda of conservatism for the remainder of our lives. In considering any strategy for the preservation of our culture and country, an assessment of the balance of forces is needed. Not only have the cultural institutions of the West been captured, but so also have the major corporate centers of power. And just as globalism is the antithesis of patriotism, the transnational corporation is a natural antagonist of tradition. With its adaptability and amorality, it has no roots. It can operate in any system. With efficiency as its ruling principle, it has no loyalty to workers and no allegiance to any nation. With share price and stock options its reason for being, it will sacrifice everything and anyone on the altar of profit. The global capitalist and the true conservative are Cain and Abel. But the growing power of global capitalism cannot be denied. Measured by GDP, 52 of the world's 100 most powerful economies are corporations, and 48 are countries. The Democratic Party is a lost cause in the culture war, and many Republicans are reluctant warriors. If a battle impends and losses are anticipated, they will vanish from camp before sunup. In a cultural conflict, a Davos Republican is no match for a San Francisco Democrat. As the Cultural Revolution took generations to triumph, it will take generations to roll back. And the great battles will not be political, but moral, intellectual, and spiritual. For the adversary is not another party, but another faith, another way of seeing God and man, and the outcome will be less often decided in Congress than in the schools, the media, and the High Court. For the prize contested is the souls of the young. "We'll get you through your children," boasted poet Allen Ginsberg, in an unconscious echo of that other cultural revolutionary Adolf Hitler. "If they do not go with us, it does not matter. We already have their children." Needed for victory is not only a conservative spirit to defend what is right about America and the West, but a counter-revolutionary spirit to recapture lost ground. To preserve their rights and their right to live as they wished, the Founding Fathers had to become rebels. So shall we. "The Revolution," wrote Jean-Francois Revel, "writes the play in which political leaders act much later." That is what this revolution has been about, capturing the culture, and with it, the power, to write the play in which the political leaders act. Regimes not rooted in cultures cannot endure. The Stalinist regimes in the captive nations of Eastern Europe never put down roots in the culture. When the threat of Russian tanks was gone, so were the regimes. Republicans today abandon moral territory they confidently defended in the Reagan era because they sense the culture has turned hostile, and they may be right. There may be more of them than there are of us. Thus, conservatives need to make alliances with any who will stand with them. Not every liberal wants to see our civilization end its days in a new Babylonian captivity. Not a few conservatives have stacked arms in the culture war. This is the struggle that succeeds the Cold War and will consume the balance of our lives. While none of us may live to see the promised land, ultimately victory is assured. For we have it on the highest authority that truth, crushed to earth, shall rise again. Of the four clear and present dangers, the population crisis of the West is the most immediate and most dangerous. History teaches that the correlation between power and population is not absolute. A few million British conquered a fourth of the world. Tiny Portugal and Holland seized territory and planted colonies in lands far larger and more populous: Brazil, India, China, Africa, the Indies. But population is a component of power. Soldier for soldier, the Confederacy was the equal of the Union, but there were not enough Confederates and too many Yankees. France's paranoia over a soaring German population after Versailles proved justified. Hitler's Wehrmacht may have been the superior in arms of the Red Army, but 80 million Germans ruthlessly organized under Hitler could not defeat 197 million Soviets ruthlessly organized under Stalin. A Soviet Union of 290 million could control a world empire. An aging, shrinking, dying Russia of 145 million will be fortunate to hold what it has. Indeed, one is hard-pressed to find in history any example of a family, a tribe, a people, a nation, or a civilization whose population has grown old and whose numbers have begun to shrink that did not have taken from it what it once took from others. End quote. Okay, so there's a few important points there. Let's just walk through. The first is where he mentions the main four dangers that face America and the West. And let's just call those out. First is a dying population. Second is the mass immigration of people of different colors, creeds, and cultures, changing the character of the West forever. In other words, people from other places who are not of the West coming to the West and changing it. That should be an obvious consequence of such things. The third, the rise to dominance of an anti-Western culture in the West, hostile to its religions, traditions, and morality, which has already sundered the West. And the fourth is the breakup of nations and the defection of ruling elites to a world government whose rise entails the end of nations. So of those four, he says that the biggest and most important problem is the dying population, toward the end of the quote. He says the biggest problem is the population crisis of the West, the failure of the West to reproduce. And I think this pairs with something else, because it's not just the dying of the civilization, it's the aging of the civilization, the average age getting higher and higher and higher because people are failing to reproduce. And at the same time, all sorts of processes are put in place to extend the lifespan. We engage in a perpetual war against death itself. We'll go to any extent, no price is too high, to keep a 98-year-old alive long enough to turn 99. I love our old people. I love my grandparents. Old people have contributed greatly to our society, but we cannot destroy ourselves in attempting to eliminate death from our society. Every person is not owed a lifespan of 100 years. We might think that what we want is for us to all sort of reach that triple-digit milestone, and anything that prevents us from living to be 100 is an affront to our dignity. But death is always among us, and we should not sacrifice our entire civilization in a fruitless battle against death. In pursuing life for the individual, we find ourselves in the death of the West, the death of the civilization, because we cannot accept that individuals die. So that's only part of it. Obviously, the failure to procreate is pretty important. It's really the major problem with our birth rates, obviously. But there's a certain expense that comes along with endlessly increasing medical procedures as science advances, and we can do this, and we can do this, and we can do this. And as the technology of the healthcare industry increases, the amount of drugs that we take to solve every last problem increases and increases. It's inevitable that a greater and greater share of our resources is going toward the battle against death. And so the tax burden and the general burden on people's productivity increases. I think I've mentioned this before, I think I mentioned recently, but if people live to be 100 and they spend roughly the first 20 years, let's ballpark, not working because they're kids or they're in school, and then they spend 40 years working, and then they retire at 60 and they live for another 40 years, then they've spent 60 years not working and 40 years working. And obviously there's some sort of threshold when such things become no longer possible. We couldn't conceive of a civilization where people spend 10 years working and 90 years not working and somehow thriving, somehow being successful or productive, spending the vast majority of our lives as non-productive people. There's no way that such a thing could happen. There's a breaking point. We should spend the vast majority of our adulthoods as productive people. So that demand for productivity for young people living in that particular working age in order to pay the expenses of the elderly creates a demand for immigration. It's why we can't just say, okay, well, what if our population shrinks? What if the birth rate is low? If we adequately protect our civilizations from external threats, then what of it? Who cares? But we can't, because we have all these expenses for the upkeep of the sick, the disabled, the elderly, various people whose lives have been extended indefinitely until everyone can reach that 3-digit mark and cross the finish line of 100 years old. The pursuit of eternal life ultimately brings about our own destruction, at least in part. Of course, there's a lot more to it than just that. We have to dig a little deeper to uncover the reason why nobody wants to procreate. That's a pretty big component of what we're facing. It's not all to be put onto the extension of life. Much of it comes down to the reluctance to create the next generation. We simply don't want to do it. And so that first point is certainly bound up in the second point of immigration. The third is the anti-Western culture in the West. And he talks about that a little bit in here. I'll touch on it somewhat. I'm not going to make that a major part of this, although I think it's certainly important and worth exploring. He talks about the Frankfurt School, who were the creators of critical theory. I'm not going to touch on that. I would recommend, as I often do, I really recommend that you get this book and dig into it to look at all the parts that I'm glossing over and skipping, like his discussion of the Frankfurt School is very important. I'll deal with the Frankfurt School in some future book, not in this one. In this one, I want to touch on a few other things. And then lastly is essentially globalism, the breakup of nations and the defection of ruling elites to a world government whose rise entails the end of nations. The hostility to nationalism, the hostility to the nation state, the endless pursuit of international organizations, globalism, and the severing of roots, and the essentially, bound up in this is the turning of people from human beings with particular interests and locales, people with roots, to rootless cogs. The global system demands interchangeable parts, which is certainly conducive to immigration. So with all that said, he does make a few jabs at capitalism. He says the global capitalist and the true conservative are Cain and Abel. Global capitalism is rootless, has no loyalty to workers, no loyalty to any nation. That's a little different than you will get from the neocon. Buchanan and the paleocons are comfortable criticizing capitalism. They are not beholden to capitalism. They understand, as they should, as most people, sensible people do, that free markets are efficient. If you know a little bit about economics, you understand that free markets are an efficient means of price discovery. And in most regards, we are capitalists. We are conservatives, we are capitalists. But we are not beholden to it as if it were our religion. We recognize that there comes with capitalism some problems, and especially global capitalism. If the bottom line is the true fiduciary responsibility and the only responsibility of all the participants in the corporation, and the corporation wields huge budgets bigger than those of many nations, and yet doesn't have any loyalty to the nation or to the people, it can become dangerous. And I like also that he says, to preserve their rights and the right to live as they wished, the founding fathers had to become rebels, and so shall we. And there's more that he said in that quote. I won't go back and reread it all, but very interesting also how he talks, how important it is to gain the youth. And in the same way that the opponents, that the progressives are constantly angling for the youth, it is very rewarding to see just how effective the right wing has been across the West in gaining the loyalty of the youth. We are winning among young men. Amazing figures coming out of Germany recently, as surveys were held in schools, and young people, like, I guess these are high school kids, voting in mock elections in their schools, overwhelmingly in favor of AfD, the quote-unquote far-right party of Europe. It's great. It's great. We can offer young men especially, young people in general, but young men especially, something that the other movements, the other global liberal establishment simply cannot offer them. And we can offer not just to young men too, but as young women see what their prospects look like in for example, in Islamic Europe, as young white women realize what their fate will be in an Islamic Europe, as they should wake up to this as sooner rather than later, they begin to migrate to AFD as well when they realize where their interests lie. The youth are remarkably important. So, with that said, I'm actually going to go all the way back to an early chapter and work through some of the early sections of the book and go into a little more detail about some of these 4 points that he makes, and those 4 points really constitute the meat of the book. So here he says, quote, "As a growing population has long been a mark of healthy nations and rising civilizations, falling populations has been a sign of nations and civilizations in decline. If that holds true, Western civilization, power and wealth aside, is in critical condition. For, like the Cheshire Cat, the people of the West have begun to fade away. As late as 1960, European people, including Americans, Australians, and Canadians, numbered 750 million, 1/4 of the 3 billion people alive. Western nations were in the baby boom of the century. Shorn of their empires, the wounds of war healed, they seemed alive with vitality. Indeed, neo-Malthusians were bewailing the population explosion, warning darkly that the Earth's resources and land were running out. They were laughed at. By 2000, however, no one was laughing. While world population had doubled to 6 billion in 40 years, the European peoples had stopped reproducing. Their populations had begun to stagnate, and in many countries had already begun to fall. Of Europe's 47 nations, only one, Muslim Albania, was, by 2000, maintaining a birth rate sufficient to keep it alive indefinitely. Europe had begun to die. The prognosis is grim. Between 2000 and 2050, world population will grow by more than 3 billion to over 9 billion people. But this 50% increase in global population will come entirely in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as 100 million people of European stock vanish from the earth. In 1960, people of European ancestry were 1/4 of the world's population. In 2000, they were 1/6. In 2050, they will be 1/10. These are the statistics of a vanishing race. A growing awareness of what they portend has induced a sense of foreboding, even panic, in Europe. In 2000, the total population of Europe, from Iceland to Russia, was 728 million. At present birth rates, however, without new immigration, her population will crash to 600 million by 2050. This is the projection of World Population Prospects, the 2000 revision highlights, released by the authoritative UN Population Division on February 28, 2001. Another study has Europe's population plummeting to 556 million by mid-century. The last time Europe's population showed a drop of this magnitude was during the Black Plague of 1347 to 52. Economics professor Jacqueline Kaysen of Humboldt State University in California, author of War Against Population, considers today's birth dearth an even graver crisis. With a plague like the 14th century Black Death, maybe 1/3 of Europe died, but it took the elderly as well as the young. But this plunging fertility takes only the young. A couple still has parents and grandparents to support, directly or through their taxes. Since they've got fewer or no siblings to share that burden, having children seems even more unaffordable. So how do you dig your way out of a hole like a shrinking population? Excellent question. And if Europe does not find the answer soon, Europe dies. How bleak is the situation? of the 20 nations with the lowest birth rates in the world, 18 are in Europe. The average fertility rate of a European woman has fallen to 1.4 children, with 2.1 needed just to replace the existing population. Says columnist Ben Wadenberg, this does not mean ZPG, zero population growth. This means ZP, zero population. Americans in NATO will soon be defending a vast leisure world. If the present fertility rates hold, Europe's population will decline to 207 million by the end of the 21st century, less than 30% of today's. The cradle of Western civilization will have become its grave. Why is this happening? Socialism. The beatific vision of European intellectuals for generations is one reason. If everyone has the promise of a state pension, children are no longer a vital insurance policy against want in old age, argues Dr. John Wallace of Bologna's Johns Hopkins University. If women can earn more than enough to be financially independent, a husband is no longer essential. And if you can have sex and not babies, and this seems to be true now in Catholic Italy as it is in secular Britain, why marry? By freeing husbands, wives, and children of family responsibilities, European socialists have eliminated the need for families. Consequently, families have begun to disappear. When they are gone, Europe goes with them. But as Europe is dying, the Third World adds 100 million people, one new Mexico, every 15 months, 40 new Mexicos in the Third World by 2050, while Europe will have lost the equivalent of the entire population of Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Germany. Absent divine intervention, or a sudden desire on the part of Western women to begin having the same size families as their grandmothers, the future belongs to the Third World. As T.S. Eliot wrote in The Hollow Men, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. End quote. Some stunning statistics in that section. He talks about Europe, and he talks about America too in here, but he does talk a fair amount about Europe, and actually I want to focus on that. The other book that I read focused more on America, but Europe is a particularly frightening situation, I think largely because, for me anyway, Europe is the homeland of the European people. America has its problems, but it also has a sort of baked-in multiculturalism that is attributable all the way back to slavery, when we gave former slaves citizenship and for their children in perpetuity. We cemented the fact that the United States is in some ways multicultural by its nature. That's just the way things unfolded, and that's who we are and how we are. That doesn't mean, of course, that we should throw the doors open. Far be it from me to suggest such a thing, but inevitably, there's a sort of multicultural component to the United States. No such scenario exists for Europe. Europe was almost exclusively white until very recently. And it is the birthplace of white people. It is the birthplace of the European race. And to see it commit civilizational suicide in the way that it is by handing itself over to foreigners for them to have their way with is deeply disturbing to an American eye. If anything, Europe should be more right-wing than the United States. By all logical measure, Europe should be much more right-wing. Somehow, that has gotten all turned around. But the main gist of that section, obviously, was, as I had described previously, the combination of two factors: the declining birth rate in Europe and in the Western world, in the North, is really the better way to put it, the Northern world. I think we should, by definition, include Russia, Canada. There's nothing really Western about Europe. It is the North. It is the North. But at any rate, the population decline in the North and the population explosion in the South, and in the Far East, in Asia, in Latin America. The third world, population boom, population explosion, billions of new people. Those are two factors that taste terrible together. So moving on from there, he talks about a couple of different nations. I want to address a few: Italy, Russia, and Great Britain. And the situation in these three nations is somewhat similar. In fact, every nation in the West is facing this problem. But I just want to touch on these three where he discusses them. I'm not going to do an awful lot of commentary here. At this point, this stuff becomes sort of self-explanatory. It's just more description of the catastrophic scenario. He says, quote, Italy's birth rate has been below replacement level for 25 years and is down to 1.2 children per woman. At this rate, Italy's 57 million people will fall to 41 million in 2050, writes population researcher Nicholas Eberstadt of American Enterprise Institute. Barely 2% of the Italian population in 2050 would be under 5 years old, but more than 40% would be 65 or older. The birth rate in that most Catholic and romantic of nations, adds New Republic's Greg Easterbrook, means Italy will be a theme park in a few generations. A recent survey in the popular semi-feminist magazine Noi Donne found that 52% of Italian women between 16 and 24 planned to have no children. Career was the principal reason for not wanting any kids. University of Rome demographer Antonio Golini says that the nation is already dependent upon immigrants to bear the load of its deeply indebted pension system. But now Italian culture is at risk, Golini believes. Italy will no longer be Italian. It will be the end of society as we know it. Golini was called a demographic terrorist 20 years ago when he first warned of Italy's impending population crisis. He is called that no longer, though Dr. Golini remains deeply pessimistic about his country. In an increasingly globalized labor market, Italy must compete with France, with the United States, with India. How can we, with such an aged population and so few young people? Cardinal Giacomo Biffi of Bologna has called on Rome to restrict immigration to Catholics, to save the nation's identity, raising eyebrows with his remark that Muslims have different food, festivals, and family morals. But where does His Eminence propose to find these Catholics? Certainly not in Spain, where in the days of the Caudillo, General Francis Franco, big families were sacred and received medals and gifts from the state. The Spanish birth rate is the lowest in all Europe, lower than that of Italy, the Czech Republic, or Romania, all of which have fallen to 1.2 children per woman. In Spain, the birth rate is down to 1.07 children per woman, and the population is projected to fall by 25% in 50 years, as the number of Spaniards over 65 soars by 117%. In one generation, we have gone from a society in which families of 8 or even 12 children was not unusual to one in which childless couples are common, or people think long and hard about having a second child, says Madrid sociologist Victor Perez Diaz. By 2050, the median age in Italy will be 54, and in Spain, 55, 14 years above the median age of Japan, the oldest nation on earth today. Prosperity has strangled us, says Dr. Pier Paolo Donati, a leading Catholic intellectual and professor of sociology at the University of Bologna. Comfort is now the only thing anyone believes in. The ethic of sacrifice for a family, one of the basic ideas of human society, has become a historical notion. It is astonishing. In 1950, Spain had 3 times as many people as Morocco across the Strait of Gibraltar. By 2050, Morocco's population will be 50% larger. If 100 Spanish young people marry today, they can expect to have 58 children, 33 grandchildren, but only 19 great-grandchildren. What of the late command post of a Soviet empire that shook the world for 70 years? With a birth rate of 1.35 children per woman, Russia's 147 million people will fall to 114 million by 2050, a greater loss than the 30 million dead attributed to Stalin. The number of children in Russia under 15 will have fallen from 26 to 16 million, while today's 18 million seniors will have grown to 28 million. In December 2000, however, more ominous news came in. Russia's birth rate had already plummeted to 1.17 children, below Italy's. Its population had fallen to 145 million. One estimate had it headed to 123 million by 2015. If you believe the forecasts made by serious people who have devoted their whole lives to studying this question, warns President Putin, in 15 years' time there will be 22 million fewer Russians. Just think about that figure. It's a seventh of Russia's population. A loss of 22 million Russians in 15 years would be greater than all the Soviet Union's losses in the Hitler-Stalin War. Putin went on to add ominously, if the present tendency continues, there will be a threat to the survival of the nation. Life expectancy for Russian men is now 59, and 2 of every 3 pregnancies in Russia are terminated before birth. Russian women average 2.5 to 4 abortions each, and Russia's death rate is now 70% higher than the birth rate. Even the return of millions of Russians from the former Soviet republics cannot offset the dying. Most ominous, for the largest nation on Earth, the population of vast, vacant Siberia is in a steep decline as China's enormous population swells inexorably. When the deputy speaker of the State Duma, the rabid nationalist Vladimir Zhirinovsky, advanced such ideas as polygamy, allowing every Russian male to have 5 wives, plus a 10-year ban on abortion, and a prohibition on Russian women traveling abroad, his ideas were ridiculed, and his population bills hooted down. But the life crisis of Russia cannot be dismissed, and the geostrategic implications for America are ominous. Mr. Chamy projected Russia's population at present birth rates with zero immigration out to the century's end, and came up with fewer than 80 million Russians in 2100, roughly the population of the United States when Theodore Roosevelt left office in 1909. Demographers have calculated that by the end of the century, the English people will be a minority in their homeland. The English are not having enough children to reproduce themselves, writes the syndicated columnist Paul Craig Roberts. This is the first time in history, says the London Observer, that a major indigenous population has voluntarily become a minority, rather than through war, famine, or disease. The Observer is mistaken. The honor of being the first nation to voluntarily turn its majority indigenous population into a minority will go to the United States. President Clinton predicted it would happen by 2050, half a century before Great Britain. But the British are clearly heading in the same direction. Ethnic minorities already constitute 40% of London's population. And as Lee Jasper, the race relations advisor to the Mayor of London, states, the demographics show that white people in London will become a minority by 2010. Among the reasons is the steadily falling birth rate among native-born British. In 2000, there were 17,400 fewer births in England and Wales than in 1999, a drop of almost 3%. And the fertility rate fell to 1.66 births per woman, the lowest since statistics began to be kept in 1924. End quote. So 3 nations there, Italy, Russia, and Great Britain, and some absolutely shocking statistics and information. And one thing that I will say, just to interject before I point out the specific blood-curdling statistics, is it's interesting that he says that Italy will become a theme park in a few generations, and elsewhere he had said that Europe will become a leisure world. Back in the previous section, let me jump back there just to get the exact statement. He says Americans in NATO will soon be defending a vast leisure world. The state of Europe, with its new population replacing its old, the dying off of the European people is in no way, shape, or form a theme park. I think he imagines that it's just going to be left empty and people will be wandering through the streets looking at all the tourist attractions, and the only purpose it will actually serve will be a tourist attraction for visitors from elsewhere to come and gape at the architecture. It's not a theme park or a leisure world. It's a hellscape. It is an absolute post-apocalyptic nightmare. I think that's a more accurate description, but I'll give Buchanan the benefit of the doubt for his peculiar terminology. But the first thing that jumped out at me, a couple of them. Let's say the first thing that jumped out at me was the statistic that says that 52% of Italian women between 16 and 24 planned to have no children. Literally, more than half of young women in Italy at the turn of the century didn't want to have any children at all. None. That's right there, civilizational suicide. It's the women of Italy putting a knife into the heart of their own nation. There's no other way to describe it. It is suicidal. And it is at the hands of young women who have decided that they do not want to procreate. They don't want to have children. And all of Europe is going to come crashing down around them. And if they think that when they're old, they're going to be treated well by their foreign nurses, they're going to find out the hard way that will not be the case. And while they may not want to have any children, they'll find that their great-granddaughters, should there be any, won't have a choice in the matter. Some additional mind-boggling statistics. Spain's birth rate of 1.0 children per woman is pretty remarkably low. And some of the stats about Russia is also mind-boggling. 2 out of every 3 pregnancies in Russia are terminated before birth. Understand, two-thirds of Russian pregnancies are aborted. 2/3. It used to be something once upon a time that, and I don't even have really, I'll be honest, I don't have on isolated on its own examination outside of the civilizational context. I'm not the sort of person that has deep, profound moral objection to abortion, particularly early abortion. Late-term abortion, obviously, begins to hit a pretty kind of grotesque area, but in its earliest stages, in the first trimester, let's say, I don't have any sort of deep spiritual or moral opposition to this. But I think that it was always sort of understood that in some circumstances, like incest and rape, or like very young girls in just like early teens or like in pubescent girls who get pregnant one way or another, that maybe there are circumstances where, okay, that makes sense. But 2/3 of pregnancies do not come from incest and rape. 2/3, 2 out of every 3 pregnancies are terminated in Russia. The abortion clinics are twice as busy as the maternity wards. I find that to be a staggering number. This isn't even today. This is in 2000, 2001, 2002. just an astonishing number to me. Mind-blowing number. Russian women average 2.5 to 4 abortions each on average. On average. The Russian woman has 2.5 to 4 abortions. She's killed her entire brood. She's killed all of her children. She may have one. All the rest of them are dead. And that leads me to a section that I kind of skipped over in the previous part that I read, but I want to draw. I want to come back to it again and restate it. A very simple statement where he says, absent divine intervention or a sudden desire on the part of Western women to begin having the same size families as their grandmothers, the future belongs to the third world. So there are two options here that can save the West. An act of God, or women decide to procreate again. And those two things seem about as likely. The entire death of the West, the entire fate of the Western world, is in the hands of women, Western women, who have decided that they are no longer interested in perpetuating their own civilization and would prefer to watch it die. And they might have thought they were going to just fade away because they're so bad. They have this sort of white guilt. And they're so bad. Europe is so bad. The European people are so bad that they're just going to scold themselves by refusing to procreate and watch their own people just softly fade off into the sunset. But every raped teenage white girl in Europe, every teenage boy in Europe who's stabbed to death, those are the ones who are paying the price. You don't get to just fade away. It doesn't work like that. You get raped and murdered. Or your children do. That's the fate that you have bestowed upon them to assuage your guilt. And on that note, he says, quote, why have Europe's nations and peoples stopped having babies and begun to accept their disappearance from this earth with such seeming indifference? Did the wounds of war or the loss of empire kill the will to live? From the evidence, neither appears to be the case. The Great War left Imperial Germany defeated and dismembered, with 2 million dead and millions crippled. Yet the German population grew so quickly after 1919 that France, which had been among the victors, was alarmed. After World War II, baby booms exploded among the vanquished Japanese and Germans as well as the victorious Americans. From studying the birth charts, we find that something happened in the mid-1960s, in the midst of the post-war prosperity that changed the hearts and minds of Western women and killed in them the desire to live as their mothers had. But if the reason Western women stopped having babies remains in dispute, how they did so is not. Contraception halted the population growth of the West, with abortion as the second line of defense against the unwanted child. First, a little history. Only once had the U.S. birth rate fallen below population replacement, during the Depression, when the economy shrank by half and a fourth of Americans' breadwinners were out of work, many of them on the streets. Pessimism, a sense of despair that the good times are over and may never come again, can apparently impact national fertility. The silent generation was born in the 1930s, a relatively small cohort, and the only generation of the 20th century never to have produced a president. The post-war baby boom began in 1946, peaked in 1957, and fizzled out in 1964. But just as the World War II generation was about done having babies, and the baby boomers themselves were about to begin, a new and more convenient way to prevent pregnancies was discovered. Historians may one day call the pill the suicide tablet of the West. It was first licensed in 1960. By 1963, 6% of American married women were using Dr. Rock's invention. By 1970, 43% were on the pill. As Catholics furiously debated the morality of contraception, and Pope Paul VI issued his encyclical Humanae Vitae, which declared all artificial birth control to be immoral for Catholics, the pill included, suddenly a graver issue arose. Arizona TV personality Sherry Finkbein, a married mother of 4, who had taken thalidomide, the drug that had caused deformities in babies in Europe, learned that she was pregnant. Mrs. Finkbein did not want a deformed child and confided to friends that she desired an abortion. When the news leaked out, Mrs. Finkbein was subjected to threats from some and offers from others to raise the child if only she would carry it to term. As abortion was still against the law, a blazing national debate ensued. But Mrs. Finkbein mooted the issue by flying to Sweden and having the child aborted. By 1966, however, the Finkbein affair was ancient history, for 6,000 abortions were being done every year. By 1970, that figure had leapt to 200,000, as Governors Rockefeller of New York and Reagan of California signed the most liberal abortion laws in America. By 1973, 600,000 abortions were being done. That year, the Supreme Court, with 3 of President Nixon's 4 nominees concurring, declared that a woman's right to an abortion was protected by the Constitution. Within a decade, the number of abortions had soared to 1.5 million a year, and abortions had replaced tonsillectomies as the most common surgical procedure in America. Since Justice Blackmun's decision, 40 million abortions have been performed in the United States. 30% of all pregnancies now end up on a tabletop in an abortionist's clinic. In 2000, the Food and Drug Administration approved RU-486, a do-it-yourself abortion drug, for use in the first 7 weeks of pregnancy. As no U.S. firm wished to be associated with RU-486, a China-based company began to quietly produce the drug. Cynics might characterize China's role in producing RU-486 for America as an act of assisted suicide for the one nation blocking Beijing's path to Asian hegemony and world power. Roe v. Wade put a constitutional canopy over a woman's right to an abortion. Yet that decision does not of itself explain the sea change in the attitudes of American and Western women. What was it that made them so hostile to the idea of pregnancy and motherhood that they would prefer to have an abortion, an act their own grandparents would have considered a monstrous offense against God and man? In the 1950s, abortion was not only a crime but a shameful act. There was no national clamor for its legalization. Yet 15 years later, a Supreme Court decision declaring abortion a constitutional right was hailed as a milestone of social progress. A revolutionary transformation had taken place in the beliefs of tens of millions of Americans. One of 2 things had happened. Either the 60s drove a moral wedge between us, or the 60s exposed a moral fracture that had existed but that we had failed to recognize. I believe the former is true. In that pivotal decade of the last century, a large slice of young America was converted to a new way of thinking, believing, and living. From 1945 to 1965, America passed through what sociologists call the golden age of marriage, when the average age of first marriages fell to record lows for both men and women, and the proportion of adults who were married reached an astronomical 95%. The America of Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy was a vibrant, dynamic nation. But as Alan Carlson, president of the Howard Center for Family, Religion, and Society, writes, all the indicators of family well-being abruptly turned in these places, Western nations, during the short 1963 to 1965 period. Fertility resumed its fall, tumbling well below zero growth levels, a massive retreat from marriage commenced, and Western societies seemed to lose all sense of inherited family order. End quote. So that's pretty remarkable. A couple things out of that section. He talks about the pill, birth control. He talks about abortion. And he talks about the abortion pill. 1/3, he says 1/3. Where is this? He says 30% of all pregnancies now end on a tabletop in an abortionist's clinic. So while we think, I think Russia's number of 2/3, I can't get over that. 2/3 of all pregnancies get aborted in Russia. We're at 1/3, which is nothing to sneeze at. One out of every 3 pregnancies are aborted. The entire birth rate crisis faced by the entire Western world can be largely traced back to this fact. That's a huge number of people. That's a huge number of babies. So 1/3. So if the birth rate is, 1.5 or something, what's it, 1.6? Let's call it 1.5. 1.5. And 2 out of 3 babies are born, and 1 out of 3 babies is not born. Wouldn't that mean that if the aborted babies were being born, that birth rate would jump from 1.5 to 2.25? Is my math right? A 0.75 increase, a 50% increase in the birth rate, which would put us right back over replacement level birth rate. We could have a sustaining civilization. We could have ongoing generations, generation after generation after generation of Americans. We wouldn't have to import our replacement if we weren't killing all of our children before they were born. Is it just me? I mean, doesn't that make sense? And that's just one, of course, of all of the liberal policies, every single one of them, which always seems to have the same effect. Fewer children, fewer children, fewer children, fewer children. Since Justice Blackmun's decision, I'm guessing that's Roe v. Wade, 40 million abortions have been performed in the United States. And this was in 2002, this book was published. So that number has certainly gone up since then. We would not be facing the death of the West if it wasn't for abortion. There's no two ways around it. That's just the simple fact of the matter. Regardless of what you think about the morality of it. As I said, I'm not particularly, first trimester, I don't really, have a deep moral opposition. Everything dies. We all die on the individual level. But civilizations don't have to die. Civilizations only die by self-inflicted wounds. Anyway, moving on from there. He says, quote, back before World War II, when Margaret Sanger, birth mother of Planned Parenthood, wrote that the most merciful thing a large family can do to one of its infant members is to kill it. She was a radical socialist far outside the American mainstream, but the Sanger animus against big families has since become a central feature of the new American feminism that was mainstreamed in the 1960s and 1970s. Today, the perception that marriage is human bondage has become a hallmark of movement militants. Marriage, writes Andrea Dworkin in Pornography, Men Possessing Women, is an institution that developed from rape as a practice. Rape, originally defined as abduction, became marriage by capture. Marriage meant the taking was to extend in time to not only use, but possession of ownership. Pure Marx. And a logical conclusion follows. The nuclear family must be destroyed, said the feminist Linda Gordon. Families have supported oppression by separating people into small, isolated units unable to join together to fight for common interests. In 1970, Robin Morgan, now the nanny of Gloria Steinem's love child, Ms. Magazine, called marriage a slavery-like practice. We can't destroy the inequities between man and women until we destroy marriage. That same year, Ms. Morgan edited Sisterhood is Powerful, containing an essay by Valerie Solanas, president of the Society for Cutting Up Men. It is now technically possible to reproduce without the aid of males and to produce only females, wrote Ms. Solanas. We must begin immediately to do so. The male is a biological accident. The male has made the world a shit pile. Not a lady to be trifled with, Ms. Solanas established her bona fides by going out and shooting Andy Warhol. By late 1973, Nancy Lehman and Helen Sullinger had circulated a new manifesto of the movement they titled Declaration of Feminism, which was broadly reproduced and widely praised. Marriage has existed for the benefit of men. It has been a legally sanctioned method of control over women. We must work to destroy it. The end of the institution of marriage is a necessary condition for the liberation of women. Therefore, it is important for us to encourage women to leave their husbands and not to live individually with men. All of history must be rewritten in terms of oppression of women. We must go back to ancient female religions, like witchcraft. Among feminists, the slavery simile competes with the prostitution metaphor. Being a housewife is an illegitimate profession, wrote Vivian Gornick, Penn State professor and author, in 1980. The choice to serve and be protected and plan toward being a family member is a choice that shouldn't be. The heart of radical feminism is to change that. I can't mate in captivity, Gloria Steinem told a Newsweek reporter in 1984. In a 1991 Wall Street Journal piece, Christina Summers quotes legal scholar Catherine McKinnon as saying, "Feminism stresses the indistinguishability of prostitution, marriage, and sexual harassment." To the militant feminist, marriage is prostitution, and the family is at best a failed institution and at worst a prison or slave quarters. A decade ago, novelist Toni Morrison told Time, "The little nuclear family is a paradigm that doesn't work." In 1994, the Chicago Tribune quoted Judith Stacy, "The belief that married couple families are superior is probably the most pervasive prejudice in the Western world." In the Jewish World Review in February 2000, in a piece titled, "Now, Pro-Fatherhood Funding is Unconstitutional," Sheila Cronin was quoted, "Since marriage constitutes slavery for women, it is clear that the women's movement must concentrate on attacking this institution. Freedom for women cannot be won without the abolition of marriage." Now, most American women do not harbor so bitter and hostile a view of marriage and family. If they did, there would be even fewer children, and the death of the West would be imminent. But millions are influenced by feminist ideology and its equation of marriage with prostitution and slavery, and that ideology has persuaded many to put off marriage and not to have children. If the preservation of peoples of European ancestry and of the Western civilization they have created were up to feminists, Western man would have no future. End quote. Quite stunning sentiments from feminists, and I'm sure he's cherry-picking a little bit, of course, but these are not minor figures. Gloria Steinem and others, Andrea Dworkin, these are major feminist figures. These aren't fringe figures. And it comes up again and again and again. An attack on the institution of marriage. Marriage is like slavery. Marriage is like prostitution. Marriage is like a prison cell. Marriage is this catastrophic institution of female oppression. Well, what does that aim at? Certainly not procreation. Certainly not children. Certainly not raising children. It's not easy to be a single mother. I lived with a single mother, and she had to work 2 jobs. Being a single mom is not easy, and I don't have any brothers or sisters, largely because I think one was enough for my mom. I don't think she could really handle more than one, because she was doing it all on her own. There's a reason that we have families. There's a reason that people get married. The destruction of marriage is the destruction of the family, and it is the end of procreation, and it is the end of our civilization. Marriage is not a conspiracy against women. Marriage exists all over the world. There's no conspiracy. It's the natural formation of human families to facilitate human procreation. Once people get to thinking about the best way to do things, and they try out a couple different systems, they settle on marriage and family formation, because no other way really works, as we can see by the results. So, I think I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.